I nail these theses to the Pentagon Metro entrance, not because I hate the department and my nation, but because I love them profoundly. And you go on to write, we are in a state of undeclared emergency. And you say it was the American industrial base that underwrote American victory and Pax Americana. It can once again, if we embrace it, as our savior. These religious tones running through your paper, quite entertaining and provocative, but also ends on an optimistic note, given much of what you talk about is how we're in a hot mess. Okay, tell us why you wrote the Defense Reformation and why your rhetoric is appropriate and right for this moment.
Well, I wrote it because I'm profoundly optimistic in this moment that change is possible. You know, I've been doing this for the better part of 20 years now. And when we first started trying to bring innovation to defense, really the kind of response from the department as we struggled through it, you know, there was no DIU. In fact, you couldn't even start in defense. You had to start in Intel. Literally only Intel existed, right? And the response was, well, the system seems to work for everyone else. This must be a you problem. Now, we live in a profoundly different world. Over these 2 decades, the department is, you know, there's side doors, there's open doors. Everyone is interested in reforming the system. But I offer kind of my lived experience over these 2 decades. What are the problems I see? And I draw on history around why we should do this. So October 31st was the 507th anniversary of Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to a church in Germany. So I kind of took the moment to say, look, these are my theses for the reformation of the department and how we can focus on the primacy of winning. You know, we have this system. So many people are captured by doing what the system prescribes that we ought to do. But the whole point of the system is to win. And so far as the processes aren't taking us there, we should take a look at that and see what we should fix.
Well, winning is a word we don't hear enough in our nation's capital, whether it's in the White House, in the Congress, or even in the Pentagon. And I definitely think it's a word that needs to get back in fashion. What I do appreciate what you've done here is so many technologists that I encounter, they're dismissive of the past. At least that's my impression. They're the sort of people that, you know, look at a liberal arts geek like me and, you know, someone who kind of looks to the past to kind of get a sense of how to, I don't know, wrap their arms, harness where we are today as just small-minded. And you know, technologists is all about dreaming about tomorrow and the future. What I appreciate what you've done here is that you actually think about the problem by looking to the past. And your first section of your thesis here in the Defense Reformation is, you talk about the Last Supper and the Great Schism. The Last Supper recalls this moment in 1993. You know, this is the end of the Cold War. You know, the peace is here, and we're going to go ahead and take this peace dividend where. Literally, the Secretary of Defense with CEOs said, okay, you guys are going to have to consolidate because we can't afford to spend as much money as we have to keep you in business, so get small. But you focus also on the Great Schism. Tell us why that is a part of this history that you think is necessary for us to understand today.
Ever a budding contrarian, you know, my take is that people focus too much on the consolidation that happened during the Last Supper. We went from 51 primes down to 5. But what I actually think the greatest consequence of the Last Supper was, and I'd say that the problem started before that, but really culminated in the Last Supper, is the schism between commercial innovation and defense. You know, if we think about our economy in the Cold War, you had Chrysler. They made cars and missiles. Ford made satellites until 1990. General Mills, the cereal company, made torpedoes and artillery. Kodak was a spy company. You know, the degree to which our American companies were invested in prosperity, yes, they're commercial businesses, but they were also deeply invested in freedom. And the nature of the consolidation, how we went about doing this really drove this apart.
But were there business reasons for that? Like one of the things that I you know, kind of obviously this is a short paper and you're hitting your points, moving on to the next point you have to make. I mean, it wasn't just about the Department of Defense having kind of a smaller budget that drove these companies away from servicing national security or, as you say, freedom. There are other drivers, you know, responsibility of shareholders and new markets and the like.
Well, yeah, and this is what my first thesis is, that the root of what ails us is monopsony. You know, and you could say, look, well, that's what the Department of Defense is. They are a monopsonist. They are the sole buyer for an aircraft carrier.
For people who don't know the fancy word monopsony, explain that.
Yeah, so people tend to know monopoly, which is when there's one seller of a thing and how much power that gives the seller in the market. Monopsony is the opposite, where there's one buyer for a thing. You know, if you're selling fighter aircraft, there's really only one organization that's going to buy that in the United States. And so you don't have all the benefits of free market, all the things that we really believe in, all the innovation that comes from the American capitalist system. It's very hard when you, as the buyer, have to think of everything that you might want, and you place that burden on yourself. And I think that's what starts, so if we go back to the 70s, in the 70s, we started to get American companies who in the boardroom, the conversation started to become, oh man, how quickly can I get rid of this defense part of my business? And that's because the government is not a great customer. It's not that profitable. It's very difficult to deal with. The kind of speciesization, if you will, of all the regulations that you have to deal with that are distinct and unique and have very little overlap. I mean, there are horror stories of Boeing where, in order to comply with cost plus accounting, they would build their commercial aircraft. They would move it over to the government division. They would tear it apart piece by piece so they can compute how much labor went into reassembling it, just so they can comply. Of course, the whole thing costs a lot more as a consequence, but it was compliant. And these are the sorts of, it makes no sense if you cared about winning, this is not how you would do it sort of things that as it kind of built up in the system, people were like, this is not a good business. The Last Supper really drove, that's when like all the ketchup came out of the ketchup bottle, so to speak, where it really drove that home, where it's like, not only did you have that happening, but you had 67% of the budget evaporated overnight. So there's just massive consolidation that had to happen, and people had, there was a market to go sell all these businesses off and drive it down.
One of the things that happened as a result is that nobody else, there are no new entrants. And, Palantir and SpaceX are like the exceptions to the rule. And then we'll see if others can break in.
I think this is really important because
go ahead.
We tend to think, we kind of undervalue somehow the role of founders and entrepreneurs in the American capitalist system. Like when we think back to the dawn of World War II and the early Cold War, we say Northrop Grumman today, but it was Leroy Grumman and Jack Northrop. It was Glenn Martin, not Lockheed Martin. And so the degree to which you had really innovative humans who were going to be highly accountable to the outcome, who, as by virtue of being founder, were not as accountable to what is happening this quarter, but had a longer arc and vision of what they were trying to accomplish. That's actually a really important part of our capitalist system. People sometimes criticize Elon in the sense of, Elon doesn't care about the department. He just wants to get to Mars. Exactly. You would not have 1,000x price performance and launch costs, which is absolutely enhancing our national security, if he didn't care about getting to Mars.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point that, the first name of some of these iconic companies are the ones we've forgotten, but it's because of them and their focus that they achieve that status. And as a result of that, in part, you were just hitting on this, the nature of the market, perhaps the public markets. You have this point here that the S&P last added a defense company 46 years ago until Palantir's addition in September of 2024. And then you put out, again, in the history section here, the defense companies by market cap, which is only one way to measure the value of a company, so acknowledge that, but still a telling one, I think. It would be hard to argue against that. Palantir, where you work and you've led, and you're one of the first couple dozen people on the team, maybe first dozen, is number 3 in market cap now. And since the time that you published this, I think you're number 2 with RTX as a pure, as a defense company at what, 160 plus billion, and Palantir now is outperforming Lockheed in terms of market cap. How does a founder piece relate to this kind of point on valuation in the public markets?
Well, I think it really relates to your ability to stick to a vision over a long term. When we were first starting the company, I can't tell you how many venture capitalists try to dissuade us from pursuing government at all. You guys are really smart. It'd be sad if you wasted your life on problems the government faces. You should really do something in the commercial world. Now, I think we do get 50% of what we do is commercial. We build every Chrysler, every HD Hyundai ship, every Airbus, but we're able to leverage that R&D base to actually enhance our national security, to add lethality to our uniformed service members. And I think there's, and I looked at that, and if you look in the present day, that seems so abnormal, this 50-50 split. But when you look at the past, it was the definition of normal.
Boeing, of course, it fits that category, or has, kind of different percentages over time, as you referenced before, their commercial company and their defense company. But there are certainly things that no commercial company is going to want to touch because it's so uniquely for defense. A perfect example is certain weapons, or a submarine, or you're going to deal with hypersonic missiles, right? So these sorts of things, I mean, there isn't a commercial application. I don't think there should be. And so it really presents a difficulty to find to not be pure play defense. So kind of how do you deal with that kind of element? And Chrysler building missiles as well as cars. I mean, make the case that's not a thing of the past.
Yeah, well, I think we're overly fixated on what people call dual use companies where you make one product that can be used for government and commercial. What we had before were not dual use companies, they were dual purpose companies. And they could leverage something about their process. The reason Chrysler could build missiles better is that they were mass manufacturers. Like when Pontiac took on the production of the Orlikaf 20 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, they took the unit production time from the Army's 3.5 hours down to 15 minutes during World War II. Why was it 15 minutes? They weren't higher IQ, they weren't smarter humans, they just had lots of experience making things that they could leverage in this capacity. And so I think you miss those lateral connections when you have this hard schism. Now, if you went to the Tesla factory floor and you tried to compare that to what the production line on a big prime looks like, you would think the big prime, it kind of looks like Etsy. Everything is assembled by hand. It's very artisanal. And that's probably what the assembly line looked like 40 years ago, too.
Well, they might take issue with the F-35's manufacturing line, but I take the broader point, and I want to get back to manufacturing. But let's continue as we're about plus 10 minutes in this conversation to the next section in Shyam Sankar's treatise here, the Defense Reformation, and the second section is called the Department's Heresy. And here's what's pretty interesting, because so many people want to criticize the primes and the way that, they are kind of organized. You just hit on, kind of their manufacturing and perhaps it's more reflective of the 20th century than it is the 21st century. But they're really a product of their customer. It's this monopsony thing coming back. And as I read your piece here, right, you get that through and through, because most of the criticism, right, and most of what needs to be addressed, you find has to be that customer. Let's go through some of those critiques. Well, why don't you take a second to give us your overall approach to the department's heresy, and I got some particulars I want to weigh in on.
Look, as a monopsonist, this is why it's so hard to be a monopsonist. Like, it really is all your fault. If you're not getting what you need, as a buyer, you have to change the incentives that you're putting out there, the structure of the market that you're trying to create. And I don't blame the primes. They are just responding to the demand and the structure of the market that they've been presented. At some point, especially once you lose your founders, you're gonna stop like raging against the machine, trying to do the hard things that you really believe in. You're just gonna say yes. You're just gonna comply. And so I think in order to fix the system, we need to think about the system itself. And it starts with this kind of, my quip on this is that everyone, including the Russians and the Chinese, have given up on communism, except for Cuba and the DoD. The Defense Department, the way we run it, it is a centrally planned, you might say centrally unplanned process, but we kind of believe in 5-year plans and that we're going to be able to allocate money in a top-down way, that innovation can be managed through a process. And I think when we look at our history, we see that's not what happened. When we were building submarine-launched ballistic missiles, Admiral Rayburn had 4 competing programs. Today, we would look at that and we would critique it as being wasteful.
Yeah.
But he got there faster and cheaper because of this.
So let's talk about kind of how the system just gets to the section 3 and really talking about what has to happen or what has to go. One that I think there's a lot of attention and the community that's breaking in. Palantir is no longer in that community that's breaking in. You've broken in and you're driving as a company, but there's a lot of folks trying to break into other parts, kind of the new tech into DoD. They talk about the cost plus contracting. You've hit on it already, and so I'll take the unenviable position of defending cost plus contracting. If I'm going to go ahead and build an ICBM, and there's a lot of R&D there. It doesn't exist there's an intercontinental ballistic missile, and there's nobody else in the world, in the country that knows how to do this. I need, someone to cover that risk. Otherwise, there's no way I could defend it to my shareholders and anybody else. That at least on the research and development side, to cover my costs. And then once I figured out how to build the thing, which is obviously so sophisticated and consequential, then I can kind of just, here's what it costs per copy and pay for it. That to me is a classic case where cost plus may be appropriate. But you come out and you say, cost plus contracting makes the nation dumber, slower, and poorer.
Yes, absolutely. So look, I will cede to you that for some of these very like people tend to go to the tail of the distribution. They talk about ICBMs or aircraft carriers. It may be appropriate that those are cost plus, but we have to recognize that there is a real cost to being cost plus, which is that you can't expect technology to deliver compounding efficiency. And so I think actually 95% of the things the department does buy, they could be buying on a commercial item basis. Think about how much SpaceX actually has been able to leverage commercial items instead of space grade military spec stuff. And they're able to deliver price performance based on that. So we have all these assumptions that get baked into the product.
So that's the SpaceX example you run with in the paper. It's what most people kind of use to counter. But there's a commercial market, now, albeit Elon Musk and SpaceX probably are responsible more than anybody else for creating this now $1 trillion plus market in space. It's private capital that got in there, is not defending it in the public markets, had a billionaire behind it. Patient capital had all these elements that allowed it to happen in the commercial space. But how come that's not sui generis? Why, is that really a case that you can argue can be replicated across a defense portfolio as opposed to just being unique to this sector that has huge commercial applications in addition to defense application?
I think, look, when they first started, the vast majority, I think even now, the vast majority of their customers are still government. It really is a government launch business. And over time, that may change. I don't see that as being different than integrated circuits. When Bob Noyce, co-founder of Intel, inventor of the transistor, co-inventor, when in the mid 60s, late 60s, I think the Apollo program in DoD was 95% of his revenue. So you could say, why aren't we buying transistors cost plus? But he always envisioned a future commercial market that these integrated circuits would change our lives. They'd be in everything that we had. And he was playing for that market. He never let more than 4% of his R&D budget come from government. Like the rest was self-financed because he wanted to have control over the R&D roadmap. So I think there's a way in which we kind of self-limit the idea of how these innovations can eventually be used and the ways in which—
Love that. Love that point. And if you're already a publicly traded company, harder to do that, right? Because everybody's getting behind the business that's working for them right now with the margins that they are, the value to shareholder, the stock, the buybacks and all that. It's hard to change the model on the fly. Let's go to another one. Here's another one out of the theses here. A budget is a plan, and no plan survives first contact. And the DoD's approach, which is the Program Objective Memorandum, or POM, big critic on, got to go, make the case.
Yeah, so there's two parts of this. One is like from a military doctrine perspective, our warfighters would never say, well, I made the plan, I'm going to stick to the plan even if it's losing. You believe that planning is invaluable, but plans are essentially useless. It's a point in time. But then somehow when we look at our budget, when we look at a requirements document, we look at it and we say, like, I support the president's budget. There's something political that enters the discourse and the conversation. So even though I don't think anyone believes it, when I hear them telling me it, I can tell they don't believe what they're saying, but there would be consequences to, not towing the line.
So what would the new reality look like?
I think we need to be able to more flexibly reprogram things. Like how does a private company or public company even run themselves? It's like, oh, I need to cancel the Apple self-driving car. It's not working. I need to invest in this thing instead. Those things are always traumatic. There's always a lot of people who, have their stake in various programs, but you're able to make those decisions.
And who is in the way, kind of stepping in the way of giving DoD that flexibility to kind of take those actions, so you're not spending time and money on by continuing something that everybody knows is not performing or producing?
I think the dynamics between Congress and the department are probably the root cause here. There's a dysfunctional relationship where if you're canceling something, it's like it somehow makes you look bad that you thought, why have you changed your mind? Why aren't you delivering it? If you cancel this, I'm going to take the money from you. So it's not really encouraging learning. It's discouraging, like brutal honesty about changing needs. Like the world changes around you. You have to be able to react to that and have an honest and open conversation about it. And if it becomes kind of zero sum and tit for tat, that's structurally quite difficult. And the idea that, we could perfectly, I think one of the greatest problems we have is this view that the department's wasting money. You had this program and it didn't work. What did you do with the money? We need accountability. Like, no one's saying waste the money, but the idea that you could somehow have a system with zero waste, that's just not realistic in any company. So you're trading off discretion. You either believe in the person. You have to bet on people. Like, I believe in the person who's running the program. They have discretion. We're going to back them to move it, like an Admiral Rickover, right? And I think I don't think the root of what ails us is technology or lack of innovation or any of these things. It's actually that we need more leadership and we need to back people.
Well, that gets the next one in your list here. The person is the program. The primacy of people is what you argue, and that's where you mentioned Rickover and some of these other people that really drove production of high quality military platforms. And this goes back to that word winning, which we started out. We need to care more about winning than about providing experiences to fill out a bingo card. And there you're talking about reflecting, I guess, your experience of the sort of people, how the military puts people in these roles and program, as program managers. And that's the concept of Rickover, who kind of oversaw, the nuclear propulsion in the Navy for decades?
30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really important because, you could say John Boyd was the founder of the F-16. You could say Rickover was the founder of naval reactors. You can really point Edward Hall built the Minuteman. Like, actually, when we go back and look at these, Kelly Johnson built 40 or so airframes, the U-2, which we still fly. When it was working, you really had people who were highly accountable. Gene Kranz did Apollo. And so I think you got to be able to stick with the program until it either works or it doesn't work.
And that you have a kind of related argument later on. Number 7 in Shyam Sankar's list, Conway's Law, your org chart. And here's where you take on Goldwater Nichols, which I think is the reason why you probably can't assign an individual name to any major program today. I don't think so.
It's a big. I think I kind of have a split mind on Goldwater Nichols. Maybe the problem is it didn't go far enough. So,
yeah, you say that. You didn't persuade me on that front. Make the case.
The case is like, okay, well, we had these pathologies where all the services were totally disintegrated and couldn't fight together. So clearly we need to bring them together. But what we ended up doing is, I'd say we got somewhere in the middle where we divided up supply and demand. And the decision making, the consensus process that you have in any company around demand and supply and figuring out how you're going to match those is the business. So we have the acquisition side or the services side who are doing the manning, training, equipping. They're providing the supply.
Yeah.
You have the combatant commanders who are dealing with real world demand, real world events. But there's no ability to meaningfully move across these things. Like, if based on real world events, I can't change what's being produced, or so that signal we've disconnected it. So maybe we should have gone further and said, actually, we're gonna bring more signal, more weight to what's happening for the combatant commanders to drive signal into what we're going to be producing on the supply side. Or you should go less far. But I think we're in this awkward intermediate period that means that we're not adaptable. Like,
I do think, though, the jointness that Goldwater Nichols drove and the kind of the way it kind of requires you to kind of punch time in different categories has, as a matter of law, prevented the next Rickover, if he's your hero in this story, from emerging. And that just seems entirely clear to me why you don't have that. They're just not allowed. You're not going to progress in your military career if you stay in one place.
Yeah. And that's part of it. It's like, that's the bingo card piece of this, which is somehow we're trying to get everyone in the same sort of career progression or ladder, versus there's no room for artists. Like, the artist doesn't follow a regimented career path. Like, Rickover was like 5'2". He's no one's idea of an admiral, like, in a conventional sense. But where would we be without him? The Soviet submariners all had to take rest breaks for 6 months at a time because they were irradiated into having leukemia. And ours, like the Standard, which I love. Rick, where did his Standard come from? He said, I want this to be safe enough for my son to be in. And like the sense of personal responsibility, it's 100 times better than civilian standards for nuclear safety. And that's paid off.
Oh, absolutely. But, he was fired ultimately just on the story because, do you know the story there with Rickover? It was John Lehman came in as Reagan's Navy secretary, and he was offended when he looked at they weren't using any automation on the submarines. So there was a downside to having somebody running the ship for 30 plus years.
Right? Like a founder is going to outlive their usefulness at some time. We shouldn't view that as a bug. That's just part of the system. It's almost a digression. I didn't make this point here, but since we're on religious themes and the whole context of my Defense Reformation,
I picked up on that.
The most interesting parts that's missing from the Western canon is someone who was raised Hindu, went to a Catholic school and then a Protestant school. You can see how I kind of, but in the Hindu tradition, you have a Trimurti, you have a god of creation, of
Right.
maintenance, let's call it O&M in military terms, and destruction. Shiva the destroyer. So like this idea that destruction is a natural part of any of these systems working, and the reinvention of it is so baked in that you almost don't resist it in the same way. It's like part of it, the entropy of the universe is happening, and you have to reinvent these institutions. And absolutely, Rickover outlived his usefulness. He went from being massively right to being wrong at some point in time. But the counterfactual of you don't need a Rickover, or we could somehow get the same results if we just systematize it. I'll go another example.
Point taken.
Shriver. Shriver was overseeing Edward Hall build the Minuteman. Edward Hall was a very difficult human to work with. No one liked working with him, but Shriver held on to him to the very second that the Minuteman worked. And as soon as it worked, it was time for Ed to go.
He bounced him. Let's go for one more on your list. I encourage all our viewers and listeners to check out The Defense Reformation by Shyam Sankar. 12 stood out to me, because it was focusing some Shyam fury on something that Congress really drives. And this is the one he said, small business programs should not be welfare. And here you're critical of the small business innovation research programs, the SBIR programs. And every year in defense of authorization, appropriations, measures, right, they're throwing money to SBIRs. And they would say, hey, this is the way we kind of fuel businesses that maybe we score on 10% of them or less, but it could be hugely valuable and meaningful. Not unlike perhaps the way the venture world makes investments. Yet you, Gus, as working for an innovative company that was VC backed, feel like the private sector should do that, and governments.
I actually love SBIR. I just think we agree on the importance of having small businesses and new entrants come in. The disagreement I have with the current setup is it's not actually measuring the outcomes. My goal is not to create a class of small businesses that are essentially zombies. They're fed just enough so that they can stay small. If you really if you want change, you should aspire for some percentage of these small businesses to get big. And that's where I think the SBIR program really fails, which is the way they structure it, the penchant for pushing these folks to get to cost plus, the idea that the government really wants to own the IP. You're not enabling these companies to get to scale. And then by doing so, fund their own R&D that makes you better off as the department and makes the nation better off by driving economic prosperity. So, the venture example is a perfect one. No venture capitalist is investing in a small business to stay small. They would all have to fold, right? Like the whole point is that power law. You don't need them all to get big. That's not realistic, but you need a few of them to be really successful. And we don't hold ourselves accountable to this at all.
Last one you have here is you acknowledge that that you're coming at this as a highly successful technologist who emerged in the world of software, and you're talking about the world where it should be measured by production and delivering platforms and all sorts of material. Why are you the person to deliver this message? Shouldn't it be the one who actually are overseeing the production line and ensuring that the warfighter has the right platform in hand?
Well, the 50% of our business that's commercial, we're helping people bend metal better with bits. Our software is used to produce every Chrysler, every Airbus, every HD Hyundai ship. So by virtue of living on these factory floors in Detroit and in Toulouse, I have a view of what are the challenges in production and how can we help? And really, I think there's a wholesale opportunity for modernizing, creating this American manufacturing stack. The most innovative new entrants are doing exactly that. They're not making it in the same old way. They're not reliant on entirely horizontal supply chains. They're verticalizing their production. They're going much faster. They're making production as software defined as possible. And that's really critical because software is our massive asymmetric advantage, right? Like, so today, World War II, we were the best at mass production. We just figured it out. Today, our adversary is. So David is going to need an asymmetric approach to beat Goliath here. And I think that slingshot is software defined. And I think the kind of fixation. So if you look at when I deal with my commercial customers in the design process, what they're fixated on is designing for manufacturability. Like from the very inception of the project, they're thinking about how can I produce this at scale? How do I manage costs in doing it? when you think about how the Defense Department looks at this is part of the pathology of financing the R&D. You're going to the FFRDCs, you're going to people whose job it is to produce an exquisite prototype. It's not even part of the assignment to think about manufacturability. So of course you end up with something that's actually really special, really technically amazing, but at best you're going to get 100 of them, and it's going to take a long time to make them. And we have to kind of, I think, bring new approaches to doing this so that we could start at the beginning and saying, I already know I'm going to need 100,000 of them, and I really care about driving down price performance. If you work at any car company and as the head of production, you're not able to drive down costs by 3 or 4% every single year, you're going to get fired.
Right.
If you compare that to what goes on in the DIB, the cost of production just goes up every year faster than inflation.
Take a minute now, Shyam. Great discussion. We're coming to the end here. We're going to hit on our lightning round just a minute. But for those who are pessimistic, and there are many, that the United States can't build anymore. And we have people who think the way to get the U.S. to build is let's start, President Trump, applying tariffs, and so that will spur manufacturing in the United States. That's one line of effort. And for those who are not into the tariff school, they prefer the free market school, but they also want to have a theory of the case that even in that environment, the United States can build again, can produce again. They can produce at scale again, right? And we don't have to be reliant on, countries, thousands, tens of thousands of miles away, right, to do that for us. What case can we make? What are you seeing that you feel that you're sounding off the cities in the United States where you and Palantir are helping? Why should we feel optimistic on that front?
Well, because I think the green shoots are very positive. So you could say, look, maybe we're not great at building in this country, but I think the reality is we do have world-class manufacturing. It's just not evenly distributed. You'd be hard-pressed to go to the Tesla assembly line or to SpaceX and think this is not world-class. In fact, we have things no one else really has. So yes, reindustrializing America is going to be asymmetric. It's going to look like a lot more automation. It's going to look like providing superpowers essentially to American workers. Like we work with Panasonic Energy that produces every battery in Tesla's Gigafactory in Reno. And the employees there are not imported from Japan with 30 years of experience. Their prior job before getting to the factory was working at the casino. And so you have to give them superpowers to make them successful.
Just to explain the superpower, what is that a euphemism for? What are you actually doing?
We're actually giving them an AI co-pilot in our case here that like takes this level 1 technician and gives them all the experiences, advice, nudges, coaching that the level 4 engineer already knows. So how do I use the history of the facility, all of the knowledge of the 10,000 page PDFs that are the manuals, the sensor data coming off of this to guide the workers as they're going through this and drive them up the learning curve as quickly as possible. And that is going to be important because unlike World War II, where we were coming out of the Depression and we had massive labor slack, we're going to have to mobilizing our workforce is going to look very different today.
Who that's in the defense industrial base or is seeking to get in is going to apply this methodology that has the ability to manufacture my words, in a smart way that you're describing. That's going to take this 21st century approach, give the casino worker that you pull, the opportunity to use the Palantir superpower and produce something that our warfighter can use.
Well, we're starting to see it happen. We're working with Anduril on production. We're working with Shield AI. We're even working with L3 Harris. And you could say they're too big to be small, too small to be big, and have the most interest in moving to a commercial model, capturing the margins that they can improve through production. And I think that's one of the reasons that cost plus makes us dumber, which is there's no incentive to go faster. There's no incentive to invest in this sort of innovation. This stuff is hard, and you need an incentive. The incentive, to steal a Bezos quote, is your margin is my opportunity. So if you can't make more money by going faster and being cheaper, it's why would you do it? We have to help create those incentives.
All right, before we go to lightning round, last question for you. And I'll pull from a recent op-ed from your colleague, our friend Mike Gallagher, who wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying Pentagon has 2 years to prevent World War III. To prepare, the defense secretary designate as the time is Pete Hegseth will need to overhaul the bureaucracy and cut waste. And in it, he advances a lot of what you describe here. But the enemy, the overhaul needs to be in the bureaucracy. That runs through a lot of what you've written here as well. What is not in Mike's piece and not in your piece is the capital required to get there. Now, if I were to talk to any CEO, they got to think about the capital that will get them there. right? They got to think about, how am I going to finance my company to build the products to solve these problems? Where do the budgets play in this place? And is it your view that we can build what we need at scale at the current national investment in our defense?
I think we are at historic lows in terms of how much we're spending on defense as a percentage of GDP. I don't think that I know that, and I think there's room to spend more, but I don't think you have to. Like, I actually think technology is something that should drive down price consistently. But there is some paradox between the commercial and the defense world. In the commercial world, we look at people as really expensive and technology as cheap. You want to automate and you want as much technology as possible. In government, the people are abundant and we view technology as expensive. So I actually think I can think of, like, in the 20 years I've done Palantir, I've only once sold a contract to someone because it was cheaper. There is no incentive for the acquisition side to really view and reward, oh, you could do this at half the price? Like, I'd love to go with that, because what are they supposed to do with the other half of the savings? They're going to have to give it back. It goes back to these dynamics with Congress. There's no reward for doing that. So I actually think by managing the incentives, we can use the current budget we have to be substantially more efficient. And that will earn us the right to go ask for more, because people have greater confidence that we can employ this stuff effectively.
Any piece of the Department of Defense you feel that we're going to start seeing that will have that story to make the case?
Let's see. I mean, it is a period of, I think, very productive volatility, even if it seems pretty chaotic. And I think these sorts of great changes and new ideas emerge in it. So that's the part that I'm probably most optimistic about.
Shyam, have you sent the Defense Reformation to the DOGE? The Department of Government Efficiency, as they go?
I certainly think a few people have. But I would say that the general officers who've read it have all, there's a knowing and hearty chuckle at the kind of catch-22 that they find themselves in. And there's been a lot of resonance with the messages.
Well, no doubt there's resonance, certainly resonated with me. But the question is, will anybody move on it and truly kind of realize kind of slay some of these barriers that you've identified? Great chat.